Well, hello everyone. Welcome. We're glad to have you here. If you haven't already answered the questions in the slide, we're asking you where you in Arizona are from and what's been your favorite book that you've read since quarantine. We are excited that you're here. I'm Donna Campbell. I'm the Advocacy Chair for Arizona Association for Gifted and Talented. And this is the second in the series of, I think we're on the wrong slide here. Jumped ahead. Okay. Here we go. This is the second in our AAGT Informed series, Responding with Solutions for Gifted Education in Uncertain Times. Today, our topic is Access Denied, Arizona Gifted Education Report Card with Dr. Marcia Gentry. A reminder that you can ask questions of Dr. Gentry in the Q&A section, and we'll answer them at the end of the presentation. If you are not already a member of AAGT, we invite you to do that. You can help to support all of the advocacy efforts we make on behalf of the gifted children in Arizona. We are an affiliate of the National Association for Gifted Children, and we are the resource for everything gifted in Arizona. So please consider joining our efforts. The 2020 Parent Institute will be held virtually on September 19th, and we welcome you to register or sign up to be a presenter at arizonagifted.org. Hope you can join us for that. Next Wednesday, we're excited to have Dr. Paul Belgen with us. These are uncertain times, and Dr. Belgen is certainly going to be a good resource for us to help sort through some of the struggles our gifted children are having. So plan to join us next Wednesday at 4 o'clock. We are so happy to have Marcia Gentry with us today. Marcia directs the Gifted Education Resource Institute at Purdue University, where she enjoys working with doctoral students and engaging in research and gifted education professional development. She remains active in the field through service to NAGC and AERA and by writing, reviewing, and presenting research aimed to improve education for children, youth, and teachers. Dr. Gentry is a friend to the gifted community in Arizona, and we are honored to have her speak as part of our AAGT Informed series. Today, she will present research from the recently published System Failure Access Denied report, including the Arizona Gifted Education Report Card. Thanks for joining us today, Marcia. It's so good to have you here. You and I have been friends for a long time, and I have always appreciated and learned so much from the work that you do dedicated to the inequality in gifted education. And I am curious to know what the catalyst was that gave root to your work. And also what drives your perseverance to continue that work? Because even though we have the data, changes have been slow in coming.
Yeah, thanks for that question, Donna. It's good to see you. You know, I am a first generation college student whose father was a state police officer. And by the way, he would be horrified with what's happening today with regard to how police are treating perpetrators and suspects and general people. He was just really a good guy who was racially and socially just. And my mother was a school lunch lady. And as I got into teaching, I had an opportunity a few years in after being a teacher and an administrator to study gifted education in a doctoral program, and I didn't really know how that worked. You know, you quit your life and you move out and somebody pays you and gives you opportunity. So I'm basically trying to pay it forward. And I've seen so many people so sure that they know who is and who isn't gifted. And the equity is poor in our field, continues to be poor, and has been poor. I haven't read a book yet this summer because I have 5 doctoral students graduating in August. And so I've been doing dissertation defenses and proposal defenses and prelim defenses. And on Monday, one of my students, Alyssa, did her prelim, and she was talking about how her sample was skewed because it was a parent sample. And she said, you know, 85% of the respondents were white. and they were largely, educated and from, upper or middle to upper income. And, that isn't representative of the population. So I had her do some digging in the Indiana report card. And I said, but how does that statistic represent gifted education in Indiana? And actually her numbers were about right, but they're not right for the population. So I'm interested in social justice, and I believe that you can have equity and you can have excellence. And that if we begin to find more talent that isn't maybe readily apparent, that it doesn't come at the expense of students who are easily identifiable. So I guess that's my answer for today anyway.
Well, thank you. Thanks so much. Well, let's get on with it. We're going to share your screen, and we're looking forward to your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I want to say to everyone who's here, thank you for coming. It's an interesting thing presenting to my computer. I can see that you're out there though, and I appreciate you taking the time. So we tried this a minute ago and now it's not sharing. There we go, share. Aha. Is that it? Everyone can see it?
Yes.
So we did this report, and Ann Gray was one of my doctoral students. She's a newly minted PhD, and she's in Arizona in Lukachukai, and she and I worked really hard on this report along with some other colleagues. And what we were looking at is access. Do kids have access to be identified? When they're identified, what is the equity? And how underrepresented are different people by race and income, and who's missing? So that's kind of the take on the report. And I'm just going to kind of buzz through these slides. And as I do that, if you have questions, just type them in. This is the citation for the report. It's a free download. I know I sent the links earlier to Donna and Heather. So you can download the full report. You can also download the Arizona report card. So the first thing I want to start with is a land acknowledgement. And you can just see that Indiana, Purdue University was built on the ancestral and unceded lands of the Potawatomi, the Shawnee, the Miami, and the Delaware people. And I want to pay my respect to the elders and their descendants who have stewarded these lands and waters since the beginning. And of course, when I tried to do a land acknowledgement for Arizona, there were 22 tribes, and I'm not going to read all of them, but clearly you are on sacred native grounds as well. And one of the things I think we could do as presenters and as people, members of this country, would be to open with a land acknowledgement. This is what the report looks like. It's new, it was just out. We kind of got caught up in the COVID news cycle. So we're going to be doing some more publicity on it, especially in light of the Black Lives Matters movement. And I want to say, before I depress everybody with Arizona's data, it's pretty much bad across the country. So you're not, special in that regard. So in 2015-16, 42% of schools didn't identify a single student with gifts and talents. So that's an access issue. Previous reports on the Office of Civil Rights data looked at how many kids were gifted and from what group and what percentage that was and how bad was the representation. We backed up a step and said, what happens if schools don't identify? And these could be schools within the same district. Donna asked earlier what got me interested. I was working in an urban school trying to fix some issues with underrepresented African-American kids. And in one school in that urban area, it was in the shadow of a very famous research university. 45% of the kids were gifted in that school. And if I drove 10 minutes to the east, there was a school that was a complete, every child qualified for free and reduced lunch, Title I school. 100% of the students were Black, and there was not a single student in that school, in the same school district, that met the state requirements to be, quote, gifted. And for me, that was a crystallizing moment, to be in a place where nobody thought any of the students in that school were gifted. So I began to think about this report to look at where can you be identified, and if so, what is the proportion? So One of the things we learned is that students who attend Title I schools are identified at approximately half the rate of their counterparts in non-Title I schools. That's not true in Arizona, but I think there's some issue with your title reporting, but I can't really sort that out because I have to use the data that are reported. But for Arizona is one of only 4 states where there are actually a higher percentage of students in non-title schools identified. American Indian, Alaska Native, Black, Latinx, and Native Hawaiian students are less likely than their Asian and white counterparts to be identified with gifts and talents, with national representation indices of 0.83, 0.57, 0.64, and 0.62. So a 1.0 would be equal representation. So, and we also looked at laws. So when I look at this law, you guys have a mandate but no funding. So you're kind of in that blue part of this graph right here. So that's just, and I have throughout the report, I bold states that have a law, and you'll see that that does make a difference. So the students who are attending a non-title school, the percentage of schools that identify nationally is about 56%. And those schools identify 13.5% of their students as gifted in those non-Title I schools. If it's a Title I school, it's 61% of the schools that identify. So that's kind of a surprise finding nationally. More Title I schools identify gifted students than non-Title I schools. That kind of surprised me, but they identify far fewer students, 7.8%. In Arizona, your non-Title I schools, it's a 0.35% identify. And again, I think there's some data that were not reported. In those schools, 5.77% of students are identified. And in your Title I schools, it's 7.45%. And roughly half of your Title I schools identify students with gifts and talents. So in terms of access, we graded the states as passing if 60% or more of the students have access to be identified. So a D is 60%, a C is 70%, a B is 80%, and anything above 90% of access is an A. And if you look at the states that have A's and B's, they all have a mandate. They're all in bold. Arizona identifies somewhere around 60% of the students in your state have access. So you pass, but not with flying colors. Additionally, in access, this is just for information. So the percentage of students identified from 22.5 to 24 is Maryland. If you look down at Arizona, you identify fewer students, and I'm not grading this or judging it. These are just data for your information. New Mexico, Missouri, Nevada, Vermont, Montana, Washington, Connecticut, Maine, Florida, South Dakota, Alaska, and Oregon identify somewhere between 5 and 7.5% of your students as gifted. So and these are of course in schools that actually identify. So I think it's interesting that a lot of places are identifying more than 10%, right? So that's just where you are. We're not making a judgment. That's just what we found. So nationally, there's little difference across city, suburb, town, and rural locales in access to identification. But when we examine it by state, only 8 states have equal access across all these locales, and Arizona is not among them. Unequal access exists for city and town locales in 17 states, and for suburban locales in 5 states, and for rural locales in 25 states. So rural kids are less likely in 25 states to have access than students in city, suburb, and town. And Arizona has equal access in cities and suburbs. So, so these are the access points. You know, if we were looking at what percentage of schools, anything above 0.95 is considered equal access. And Arizona, you can see, is 0.59% the access in town schools and 0.84 in rural schools. You have equal access in the other sites. So within the nation, total identified gifted in schools that identify, there are 3,255,000 students. That's 9.57% of this population in the most recent data collection year. But that splits to 13.5% in non-title schools versus 7.86% in title schools, with a ratio of 58% of the students in a Title I school being identified compared to a non-title school. So you can see that it's gotten worse since 2011. We have data from 2000 in the report for baseline, but we don't have the title, non-title information from 2000. So here are these same data for Arizona. You actually have a ratio of 1.29. So you have slightly more students being identified in your Title I schools than your non-Title I schools. And that's a good finding. That was not the case in 2011, nor was it the case in 2013. So some improvement there. Also with regard to access, this is the ratio. So there aren't many states that have a good ratio of Title I to non-Title I with regard to identification rates, and Arizona is one of them. Hawaii, New York, Montana, and New Hampshire are the others. And with regard to access by race, so AIAN, American Indian, Alaskan Native, this is nationally, right? So 67% of the students have access nationally, but nationally only 62% of the Native youth have access. That's at 92% of all students. So it's a grade of a B. You can see everybody else is above 0.95. So nationally, the only students who have less access than their other race peers are Native youth. And these are students, all students in all public schools across the country. It's population data. So out of the 50 million students, 33 million have access. But in Arizona, and this is kind of sad because you have a larger percentage of American Indian youth than many other states. So you have 53,000 Native students in public schools, but only 23,000 of those have access. 63% of your students in Arizona have access, and that means they attend a school where they could be identified, but only 43% of your Native youth attend such a school with access at 0.68% of the rest of the students. So one of the reasons you have so many missing Native youth in Arizona from gifted is that they're less likely to attend a school where they could be identified. We use the representation index, which is really the percent of the students who are gifted in a group divided by the percent of the students, those same students, from the total. And we use the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission rule, which is 4/5. So that gives us a 0.80 criterion, and anything less than that is failing. It doesn't mean that 0.8 or 80% of the total is good. It just means that it's within EEOC guidelines. So the representation index in Arizona, this is in all schools that identify, in your non-title schools, in your title schools, and then there's your ratio of Title I to non-Title I. So the representation index for Native youth in Arizona is 0.55. It's 0.91 in the non-title schools, but this is a very small number of schools, and it's 0.55 in the Title I schools. So you can see that there's not a lot of influence here. So that means that 45% of your Native youth are not being identified. Asian students are identified at a rate of more than double their percentage in the general population. Black youth at 0.43, Latinx at 0.65, Native Hawaiian 0.72, two or more races 1.17, and white children at 1.48. I want to make a note here that I'm not going to use the word overrepresented when I talk about Asian, two or more races, or white children. I'm going to call them well represented, and I would like to see other students, other groups of students well represented as well. So what we're really looking for is a ratio of 0.95 or greater in identification, so that they're equally likely to be identified, not half as likely. When I break this out, just because I think it's important, I don't want to talk about Arizona in a vacuum. So when I break this out, you can see that compared to all the other states, and you can see how bad it is for Native American youth, right? There's only 6 states where they're equally represented at 0.95 or greater in the whole country. There's 5 states when they're in non-Title schools, and there's 5 states in Title I schools. So other than that, they're down here in the failing ground, and that's where Arizona is for overall and for Title I students. And so there's, and again, I'm not trying to beat anybody up. These are baseline data. This is a place to start from. I do think it's super sad, though, that when I look at places like New Mexico, Montana, Arizona, Idaho, Oregon, Alaska, South Dakota, when I look at these states, Minnesota, they have large populations of Native children, and they're failing. And to me, that's like doubly sad. This shows you the access ratio compared to the representation index. So you have low access, and failing representation. And again, Alaska's probably the worst, maybe South Dakota and Montana. So you're not the worst of the failing, but it's not a good picture. This is for Asian students, and I've just highlighted, and notice how this picture looks just the opposite than the American Indian picture. This is for Black students. So Black students overall, and Black students in non-Title schools, and Black students in Title I schools. And you can also see how sad this is. When we look across here, across all the states, there's 2 states where Black youth in non-Title I schools are well represented, Illinois and Michigan, and they don't identify a lot of kids. So, you know, they may have like 15% of their kids with access, and none of these states, when I have them in bold here, they're the top 10 population states. So none of these states have large populations of Black youth. Latinx, again, we have a little encouraging news with Florida, Colorado, and Texas, all of whom have large populations, but they're only good if it's a Title I school. Arizona is near the top of the failing states for Latinx kids, but you're still below the 0.8 threshold. And then this shows you kind of where you are. You have decent access, but underrepresentation for Latinx youth. So even though they have good access to be identified, they're not being identified at rates commensurate with their proportion in the population. These are Native Hawaiian kids, and you know, you're close to passing up here and kind of at the bottom in the non-Title schools down here. These are students who are 2 or more races, and that's kind of a catch-all phrase. So you see like a split there, but Arizona's doing fine with students who report 2 or more races. And of course, like the rest of the country, you're doing fine with white children. And then the last piece, so we talked about access. Do I go to a school where I could be identified? If I do, what is my proportionality of being identified? And then the last piece is, okay, so who's missing? If there are places that don't identify, then all of the students in those places who could be gifted are missing. And I don't believe that the school I described earlier, where all of the children were Black and all of the children ate free and reduced lunch, qualified for the federal meal program, I don't believe that there are no gifted kids in that school. In fact, I would say that that school probably needs a talent development program more than the school that has 45% of its kids identified. And yet, because 45% of the kids are identified, they get all the resources. So they have all the enrichment teachers, and the other school has nothing. So nationally, we have 3.2 million students identified and 3.6 million missing across all races. But you can see that the missing students are disproportionately Black, Native Hawaiian, Latinx, and Native American. So up to 3/4 of the Black students are missing, 2/3 of the Latinx and Native American and Hawaiian kids are missing. When you see 29% to 49% of 2 or more races, or 29 to 42% of the white students, those are largely missing, not because they're underrepresented in the schools where they're identified, but because they go to the 1/3 of the schools that don't identify students at all. So here are your missing students. So here's Arizona. You have missing students at the lower boundary and at the upper boundary. So somewhere between, these are students who are not identified, and these are students who are under-identified, for a total of 42,000. These are students who attend schools without ID and with ID, for a total of 28,000. So you have somewhere between 35 and 44% of your gifted students identified. You've got 28,000 students, 53,000 students identified as gifted, but somewhere between 42 and 28,000 missing. But you can see that of those missing students, the majority of them are coming from Latinx, Black, and Native American populations. So it's striking to me that you have 941 Native youth identified in the state, but you're missing somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000 students. So that's problematic. Same thing when you look at your Black students. You have 1,200 identified, but you're missing 63 to 71%, somewhere between 3,000 and 2,000 students are missing from those identification roles. So if I graph this, what you'll see, the black bars are how many kids are actually missing across the country. So I don't want you to feel bad, because here's Arizona, but if you look across, many places are missing many Native youth. Same thing here. Here's Arizona with regard to your Asian youth. You're missing, and you can see how these states that are missing 100% or almost all of them, they don't identify any kids at all. If I look at Black youth, here's Arizona. You're missing about 70% of them. That's kind of average, which is really kind of sad, right? Across the country. When we started this project, I was looking for, like, wow, I'll find some places where they're doing it right, and then we can go study those places, and then we can provide examples for other places on how to do it right. And what we found was depressing. The Latinx youth here, here's where you are, again, kind of in the middle, but a lot of kids missing. 20% would be like acceptable missingness, and this is not acceptable. Native Hawaiian youth, here's Arizona, but again, you can see that I just didn't want you to feel like I was picking on you, because the whole country's in this pickle. So, and 2 or more races, maybe you're doing a little better than a lot of places on missing youth there. And then again, here's our white kids, not so many missing. So your report card looks like this. You can download it. It's in the main report, but the report card comes with like a 6 or 7 page narrative that explains each of the grades. So you got a D in access. You rank 31st among 50 states plus DC in access. You got an A in equity of access, and you rank second between Title I and non-Title I schools. So that's a good finding. And equity of access by race, you get A's except for your access for Native youth. And then down here, all of these are related to statewide, city, suburb, town, and rural. And you can see the Fs are in red and the passing grades are in green. So there's plenty of room for some improvement. I'm hoping that the data weren't too depressing. And what I'm going to do now is I have 3 or 4 slides that we can talk about what you can do about it. Because I think of these, we will update this every other year. And we're working on a website, an interactive website that will let you go in and click. And I also have information on how you can look at your own school's data as well. It's not that only I can see it. You can log on and look at your own data and see where you are. So things that affect identification. First of all, in order to be identified, you have to go to a school where students with gifts and talents are identified. So that's access. If you attend a wealthier school, typically wealthier schools identify 50% more students than non-wealthier schools. If you're white or Asian, you're 2 to 10 times more likely to be identified than if you're Native, Black, Latinx, or Hawaiian. And if we use tests, and we're finishing up an article on this, but using tests for identification that yield disparate results, or were not normed on the population to which they're being applied, and applying national normative cutoff scores to these measures as the most important or only pathway to identification, that's a sure bet that you're not going to identify youth. We looked at the top 5 group measures of ability and the top 5 individual measures of ability that all the states say that you can use for identification. And only one of those tests had Native youth in their normative samples at all. And only 2 tests actually looked at differences by race, and none of them reported how the means are lower for Black and Latino kids. And so if we use these tests, and the tests at the beginning when they were developed, weren't developed for use with those children, and they yield lower scores at the beginning, then at the backside when we're identifying for programs and we find fewer kids, why would we be surprised? So that's a study that'll be coming out soon, we hope. Requiring multiple measures rather than multiple pathways. So people confuse those. Multiple measures means you have to have an achievement score and an ability score and a teacher recommendation. And when you start adding ands in, you narrow the numbers of kids you can identify versus you could have a high ability score or a high hope scale score or a teacher recommendation. That would be multiple pathways, multiple entry points. And we don't believe that the most important measure is a standardized measure because those measures result in disparate identification rates. Failing to account for and mitigate differences in opportunity to learn affects identification. Requiring teacher referral as the first step to identification. If a student has to be referred by a teacher, sometimes we call that a gatekeeper thing, teachers don't refer students they don't like. And white teachers are less likely to refer brown students. Brown teachers are equally likely to refer white students and brown students. And our teaching force is largely white, and that's not a criticism, that's just a fact. Failing to diversify the teaching workforce and to employ and graduate culturally competent teachers is an issue, and continuing to allow gifted education to be used as a tool of economic and/or racial segregation is also an issue. So what can we do? First of all, you have a mandate, so you need to ensure that all schools identify youth with gifts and talents. We need to examine and improve rates of programming and identification in Title I schools. We need to put into place equitable procedures and programming designed to develop and reveal talents among the children, especially those who have been underserved for generations. If you're from a middle class or wealthy family and your child is scoring at the 90th to 95th percentile, that's equivalent to a child who comes from a low-income family's 70 to 75th percentile. So think about all those identification procedures that say you have to score at least 90 and then we'll screen you further. Well, you're leaving out all of your low-income kids. And I would say to you that a child who scores above the 50th who qualifies for free and reduced lunch is potentially gifted. You should be looking at them. You can use this link, and I sent this PowerPoint to Donna. So you can use this link to find your own school and examine your own data and then say, here's where we are, where do we want to go? You can make efforts to diversify the teaching workforce. You can hire, develop, and nurture culturally competent and culturally responsive teachers and support their use of pedagogy and curricula to which all students can relate. You can create learning environments that favor talent development over remediation for all students. I mean, if we figured out what kids were good at and what was interesting to them and we did that with them, we'd have a lot more gifted students. And you could consider implementing interventions that have been shown, promise with regard to addressing equity. So these are the directions for how to do your own school search. That's in my PowerPoint. And our work involves the total school cluster grouping program, which results in more children doing better over time and more students from underserved population being identified at higher levels of achievement. Our Hope Plus work is, we have partnerships with Navajo Prep, with Lukachukai, with Ganado schools, and so the kids from Arizona, Native youth, have been coming to Purdue's campus for the last 10 years, except for this summer, of course. Maybe it's 11 years. I think we started in 2009. And they're, you know, learning and integrating and thinking about college, and it's been a really, really great experience. We also have students from the Ojibwe Nation and from the Lakota Nation. We've done work on the Hope Scale, which is a teacher nomination scale for students. We've done work with Whiting's Scholarly Identity Model, of course, school-wide enrichment. Purdue has a teacher certificate in talent development. We have an affective curricula. I love Margarita Bianco's Pathways to Teaching, where she goes into high schools and talks to students of color about teaching and social work as a pathway to social justice. And I think we can improve education by using gifted ed pedagogy, making sure that we have not a program, but a continuum of services, and bringing to light inequities and calling for change. So this is our report, and this is where you can find us. And somehow I need to find the questions, because there's how to examine your own data. Yeah, and then I've got all the other report cards in there. So I didn't want to talk the whole time, so I think I've got like 20 minutes left. And I'm gonna flip over, I'm gonna stop sharing. Okay, now what? And I'm gonna go to questions. The first question that I'm reading says, do these numbers include private schools? No, these are all the public schools, and it's the Office of Civil Rights data collection, and they do that every other year, but it is census data, so it's every public school in the entire country. Which one test had Native youth in its sample? I think it's the Ravens. I have to look. That's a good question. And I can look that up and I will send Donna the answer because we looked at 10 of them, and about a week ago, I sent the revision back to my colleague and I haven't looked at it since, but I believe it was the Raven that included Native youth, and the other 9, and I'm talking about the B'nai and the WISC and all of those other tests did not include any of those students. Yeah, up to parents. I agree, Tucson, Jody. It would be very frustrating because the parents who are going to contact the gate department are the parents who have social capital. And there's nothing wrong with parents advocating for their children. I mean, we want parents involved, but if you're a parent who didn't graduate from school or didn't have a good experience in school, or you don't know how to work the system, then that's going to widen the gap. That's really, Jody, that's super frustrating. The Ravens progressive matrices is a measure that can help identify underrepresented populations, but it doesn't have, like any of the other tests, it doesn't yield equal proportions. So it does better than some other measures, but it's not the answer. Just like, you know, everybody was thinking that we should have, you know, nonverbal tests would be the answer. If we just use nonverbal tests, then we would find diversity. Well, we got a, you know, like maybe 2/10 improvement, but, you know, it went from 0.4 to 0.6. That's still 40% underrepresented. So what we have to do is we have to look at the the test, who it was normed on, and what the scores are. And one of the things that we can do absolutely is to begin to use, if we're going to use standardized tests, we need to use standard group, local group norms. So in the school I described that was totally Title I and totally Black, that school, we could use a building norm because all the kids are living in the same circumstances. But if that school was 60% free and reduced lunch and 40% non-free and reduced lunch, and we used a building norm, we would identify the non-free and reduced lunch kids. So it's possible now with the aid of programming and computers, as long as the variables are in the data set, it's easy to ask for local group norms. So that it's not just local norms or not local building norms, but local group norms. And then that way you're going to say, well, here are, you know, students who are at the top of their peer group, and that can be helpful. Oh, I need to scroll, sorry. Do we have information on the numbers of underidentified population who identify as twice exceptional? We do. We have not analyzed those data yet. So we know that the two groups who are most underrepresented in gifted education are ELL and students with disabilities. So, and I don't know, like when we look at disabilities, I don't know what percentage should be identified. So I'm working with a couple of colleagues in special education to try to crack that nut, you know, to take a look at what we know about who's identified and who isn't and why aren't they being identified. That's a super important question, Amy. Thank you for that. We just haven't, we just finished this report, so we haven't looked at the ELL data or the data on special education. Zell asks, is there a study that shows why providing access to gifted is important for all students? We look at outcomes. There was just an article by Lubinsky et al. In Journal of Educational Psychology about long-term effects of having access and being identified. There are plenty of studies out there. And I think some of the things that we also need to study is what happens when you don't have access. What happens when, you know, the counselor tells you that you're not smart and you shouldn't go to college. So that is one of the things that we were having to argue in our most recent thing is, so if a kid doesn't get identified, what happens? Many years ago, this is KJ, trying to identify underserved populations, tried to develop a more comprehensive checklist. Any recommendations? You know, the work done by Baldwin was good. Mary Frazier had a really nice talent development survey. Our Hope Scale is a good way to do it. You know, the point is we have to look at the problem from many perspectives. I don't think there is an answer that will say that this will fix it. But when we begin to think about, and my colleagues at UVA did something that I thought was brilliant. We were having this discussion of what do we do? How do we fix this? These numbers are horrible. And Tanya Moon said to me, well, you know, we just, we primed the teachers and they rose to the occasion. And I said, what do you mean you primed the teachers? She says, well, we told them that there was underrepresentation and we needed them to be talent scouts and nominate kids. And when we asked them to do that, they did. And I'm like, and I've always been a teacher advocate. I've never been somebody who thinks that we should teacher-proof schools. I mean, teachers are the most important thing in the school next to the kids. And so maybe something as simple as saying to the teachers, look at our data. We're identifying, you know, only 30% of the students we should be identifying of color. Can you help me find students? I mean, that may be something that would work as well. We tend to think we have to have a formal instrument, and maybe we don't have to have a formal instrument. I always think about, you know, instrumentation, and people are like, oh yeah, but and it's hard to get a really high score accidentally. So I'm not saying the instruments don't identify. I mean, you know, I said earlier that I'm not going to talk about over identification. I'm going to talk about well identified. but we have to keep in mind that those measures were all developed by people and they all have error. So just because it's a psychometric instrument doesn't make it accurate, doesn't make it right, and it doesn't mean that it works in every situation. When you think, what do you think about cluster grouping in regards to meeting the needs of gifted students? I actually have a book on cluster grouping. I'm not trying to sell it. The proceeds go to low-income kids who can't afford to come to camp. But and you have Dina Brulis, who also has a book about school-wide cluster grouping. I would not do cluster grouping where I would just find who's the, quote, gifted kids and put them in an otherwise heterogeneous classroom. It's a little more nuanced than that. I would want to have a total school approach to cluster grouping. And I agree that if we give every teacher one of every kind of student in the name of fairness and equity, you know, and have huge class sizes, that everybody's going to equally struggle. So I do believe that cluster grouping, especially in elementary school, can be a super good help to dealing with issues of equity. Local group norms, but does that mean look at your district as the local group and figure out who we are identifying and then decide, okay, so Vanessa, that's a good question. The first thing you need to do is look at your data and use the formula that I shared, you know, go to the OCR site or look at your data in your regular database and figure out if your proportions of the race or income groups that you have in your school, figure out how bad they are. They're going to be bad. They're going to be out of proportion. Everybody is. Figure out how bad it is. And then when you test, you ask the test publisher to give you a local group norm. So let's say that your school district is largely Title I. And in your school district, I'm making this up, but let's say that it's a largely Title I school and the whole district, and that your average achievement is a standard deviation below the national norm. So the national norm's at 50 and you're at 40. And then if you compare yourself to the 50 standard nationally, you're going to identify fewer students, right? So what you do is you say within our school district, we have Latino, we have Native American, we have white, we have Black kids. So what we want is we want local group norms for all of those races. Or you say we want a local group norm for low income and for non-low income kids. And then you look at who is the top of which group. And then you have to think about what kind of programming you do. So if you're identifying 10% of the kids in your school, are you identifying 10% of your Black kids? Are you identifying 10% of your Native kids? And if not, why not? And maybe it's because there's a poverty effect and they come to school less prepared. So are you offering an enrichment program to help them develop their talent? Or are you assuming because they're not scoring at the 90th, they're only scoring at the 70th, that they're somehow average? So if you begin to look at local group norms, what that does, and every test developer, even our Hope Scale shows you how to do that. So yes, that's what I'm talking about. So you look at your district data, but then you have the data that comes back to you instead of just nationally normed, have it locally normed. Can a teacher request alternate gifted testing for students? I would hope so. You know, this idea of take a test and do well on it and you're in, or do poorly on it and you're out. I mean, if I were in a live setting, I would ask you guys to raise your hands and tell me how many of you know a student who is really smart but who doesn't test well, or how many of you were that student. How many people would love to do a PhD but they don't want to take the GRE? The test is a measure of something in a certain time, and some people don't test well but they're brilliant. And then people will say things like, she's not really gifted, she's just, you know, she's just high achieving. She works really hard. But I gotta tell you, if a student can achieve at a really high level, then they have the ability to do that. What that means is they're not really gifted, is they're not measuring gifted on whatever measure flavor of the month test that district is using. And it's condescending and it's rude to say to a kid who's working really hard and achieving at a really high level that you're just a high achiever, you're not really gifted. you don't qualify as gifted because we are narrow-minded and we only use one measure to qualify you is more of an honest statement. But I'm being obnoxious now, so I'll try to tone it down. I feel talented groups should be motivated and trained by, I don't know where that's going. Oh, sorry, all teachers, and then the output will be best. I think all teachers should have background in training and talent development strategies. I agree. I mean, I think that if we want our students to do the best they can, we have to have teachers who believe that they're capable and that they're capable of doing great things, and that they're going to find what it is they're interested in and be able to perform at high levels. So, you know, that to me is, you know, I lived in Minnesota, as did Donna, for a number of years. And I have a metaphor that I like to use. In Minnesota, everybody, all the kids ice skate, they all play hockey. And I'm like, how did they get to be good at hockey? Nobody measured their foot and decided they would look good in skates or look good in a uniform. They gave the kids ice skates and hockey sticks and hockey pucks and ice time. And they figured out who had an aptitude for it and who was good at it and who liked it. But the point is, they put ice skates on everybody. And I think in school, we should put talent development, you know, on everybody. We shouldn't have to have a IQ measured of 135 before we have the opportunity to do enrichment and to pursue our interests and to do good things. Camille, is there research to show whether or not gifted students perform better in self-contained environment? Research that has compared settings between high or special schools, special classes, pull-out classes, and within group classes shows the biggest effects are in special schools, followed by special classes. But that research in and of itself can be mixed because it depends on what goes on in those environments. And if we do self-contained kids, there are other kids who are equally capable who get left behind. So we should be programming for the kids who are not in the self-contained program in order to develop their talents. And that's kind of what I meant about a continuum of services. You can have a special school, a magnet school. You can have a self-contained class. You can also have a cluster class. You can have a school-wide enrichment model where kids go out and do type 3s and all of those things.
We still have a few minutes, Marcia. Is there another question on the Q&A that you would like to address?
I think there's two that just came in. Sorry.
Okay.
Just clicked out of there when I saw your face. Did I see correctly? There's a survey somewhere to get a PhD certificate. The answer to that question is we have a gifted education certificate that's fully online at Purdue. And we have a master's in learning design and technology, which, by the way, would come in handy these days, right? I had to move everything to online with zero, as did everybody else. But we don't do a PhD online. We actually have people come here and live for 3 to 5, 6 years. So that's why, you know, it's like I have 5 graduating and I haven't seen them since March. So it's, yeah, it's tough. It's like having children move away.
Well, I appreciate everything you talked about, but before you go, I really did want you to talk a little bit more about the Hope Scale. There are some questions coming in on the chat too, but I think that'll address some of the other issues that were floating in on our minds here. So can you tell us a little bit more about the Hope Scale?
Yeah, a number of years ago, like maybe 2008-9, we received some funding from the Jack Kent Cooke Foundation, and our charge was to provide enrichment for lower income kids in our Super Saturday and Super Summer programs. The problem was that we couldn't find any districts that were commutable who had identified low income kids as gifted in Indiana, which is kind of typical. I didn't realize at the time how widespread that is across the entire country. And so we first had to help the teachers recognize talent in kids that weren't meeting the state criteria. And so we developed a Hope Scale, and it stands for Having Opportunity Promotes Excellence. That was the name of the project. And we we had, I don't know, 9,000, kids hope scales that teachers filled out, and we did a bunch of psychometric magic with it, and we oversampled low income kids, we oversampled brown children, Hispanic and Black children. We have a study that Jason did on Native American youth with it. And what we did was we found it was invariant between income groups, and it was invariant between racial groups, which is something that those other tests that we're looking at now didn't even look at. And so what it means is it measures the same thing. And we originally made it available on our website, on our instrument repository for free, because the Jack Kent Cooke Foundation has sponsored my work to the tune of several $millions over the years. And it just didn't feel right to me to profit on an instrument designed to identify low income children. So ethically for me, that was wrong. But because it was free, people weren't using it. So we published it with Proofrock, and Joel kept the cost down, and we take our royalties and we put them back into the scholarship fund. So I'm not profiting on that scale, but now that you can buy it, more people are interested in it. It's in 3 languages now, but there are 2 other languages it's being normed in. And it's a teacher nomination scale with 11 items. It measures social and academic components of giftedness, and it is correlated, but not tightly correlated with achievement and with aptitude. So it measures things that teachers see that you can't measure with another kind of test. So it will find kids that won't be found by an IQ test, but it also, kids who have a high IQ probably may have a high hope scale as well. So it's an additional tool that can be used to help you find underserved children.
Very
in a
good.
nutshell. Yeah.
Yes. And the Jason you referred to is our Jason McIntosh right here in Arizona. So everybody tuning in probably is pretty familiar with him as well. So,
Jason's one of my doc students. Yeah, he was here for a number of years. I miss him a lot.
Yeah, he left us for a while, but fortunately came back. So, well, we want to thank you so much for joining us today. This is just so inspiring. And I think, you did refer to the fact that we have some work to do here, and we're working on it. So really appreciate it, Marcia.
Let me know how I can help, and thanks for tuning in, and I hope it was helpful.
Very good. It was. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Everybody, we so appreciate you tuning in. We hope you join us for our next 8 of these webcasts. If you complete the short survey, you see it on the screen there, your professional development and gifted enrichment certificate will be issued to you. So we hope to see you again soon. Thank you so much. Thanks a lot.
Bye, everybody. Thank you.
Yep. Bye-bye.